This is our fourth meeting discussing Kant's Critique of Pure Reason, and next week we will be looking at the strategic overview that he provides in the Transcendental Doctrine of Method. And I will be able to say there are these 2 pages that we will read together, and then I'll try and make some connecting remarks. Because they're famous pages when he asks, what can we know, what can we hope, and so on. And we'll look at that together. So I'll email those pages after. I received during the week a copy of the Australian Australasian Journal of Philosophy, because to give a paper at their conferences, you have to pay a ridiculous subscription fee and get this thing. And I just want to, to see where we're at philosophically. I open it up. The articles are: 1, better foundations for subjective probability; 2, fallibility and dogmatism. So they're talking about how we talk about things. And now if we look at the very first line of the first essay: in philosophy, psychology and economics, we often ascribe subjective probability or credence to people. For example, we might say that Anne's subjective probability that it will rain tomorrow is 0.3. No human being in the history of humanity has said Anne's probability that it will rain tomorrow is 0.3. Right? Now, why? But his response would immediately be, I said in philosophy, psychology and economics. Right, okay, so why in the social sciences are we ascribing quantifiable predictions to people about what might happen? Because social science is attempting to become physics, which the core of which is a mathematically verifiable prediction, which you can then test by seeing if Mars is in the right place or if the atom bomb goes off or whatever it is. Now, Kant is both aware of this problem and attempting to ameliorate it. He is attempting to argue that the scientific truth that is mathematically quantifiable is objectively verifiable, but it's not the whole of reality, and he wants to preserve freedom for morality and the experience of beauty. So on the one hand, he's aware of this problem and attempting to combat it. Unfortunately, he has radically exacerbated it, and he's done this because of the following problem. And I make this one suggestion. He says himself, no worries. He says himself in the preface, and I think we read this passage, if philosophy has not made any progress, then it should model itself on the natural sciences and mathematics, which have established themselves as a science. Now, he's very careful, and I've just explained how he's trying to say that philosophy, transcendental philosophy, is distinct from natural science and goes beyond natural science on the one hand. But on the other hand, there's an underlying conception of reason that is taken from mathematical and natural science. And for him, natural science is modern natural science, which means inherently mathematical, which means that his conception of reason is that a true statement must be universal in a mathematical sense. Now, this contrasts strongly with the entire classical philosophical tradition, for which the highest degree of understanding is not a universally applicable law. There is no such thing. It's the understanding of the character or the being of things, which is itself not quantifiable. That's why in Physics, Book 2, Chapter 3, Aristotle argues that physics can't be mathematical. They're 2 different studies. Now, I just make this point because this is like Kant is at the crossroads. He has been inspired by Rousseau, who has argued very persuasively that there is not a necessary congruence between advances in the natural sciences and advances in human character and morality. So Kant can see that problem, and he's attempting to ameliorate it. I'm suggesting that ultimately he exacerbates it. But we'll come to that next week when we try and look at the strategic view. Today we're still stuck in the trenches with the slowly proceeding bombardment moving forward over no man's land towards us. What I wanted to do, just as a introduction to a couple the passages I mentioned, is very quickly glance back at a couple of passages in the Transcendental Aesthetic Because although it's only a shorter chapter in the book, like 30 or 40 pages, it's fundamental for his view that concepts constitute our experience. And that... Okay, so I'm going to share the text, and we're just going to look at a couple of sentences which I need to find here. So this is in the B edition of the Transcendental Aesthetic. Okay, so, and this is from, it's on the translation, it's page 176 to 7.
Yeah.
And I just have to manipulate some.
What's the...
Am I sharing the text?
Yes.
Yes.
Thank you.
B41.
Yes, no worries.
So B43, thanks Peter. B43, which is page 177, which I need to use a different method of getting to. Yeah. Where are we? Almost there. Okay, B43. Now, at B43, we're in the middle of a dense paragraph. And to help that, we're going to go to the beginning of that paragraph, which is it's got a little B in it, which is in B42, at the top of the page on our translation. But B42, top of the page, small letter B, comma, space is nothing other than merely the form of all appearances of outer sense, i.e., now, okay, so space is not a thing in itself. We don't derive our notion of space from things that are in space. We experience things in space because they are constituted by that form of being spatial, right? But spatiality itself is not something in the thing. Being in space is, right? So he's saying it's the form of the appearance rather than something taken from the appearance. Okay, so then he says that is, right, the subjective condition of sensibility. So to sense something, you have to sense it in space. That's our human capacity, is that we are bodily embodied intelligences. So we need to sense something, it has to be in space. But then that means, he is saying, that it's the subjective condition that is for it to be possible for us to see something in space, it must come under the form of space, right? So what he is looking for, and you get this phrase very frequently throughout this book, he wants the condition for the possibility of X, right? Now that presumes we have X, right? But I think we all can agree we experience things that are in space. Now, just as a contrast, to look for the condition of the possibility of something means that possibility is higher than being, right? Now the classical tradition is that being is higher than possibility. Actuality is the end towards which potentiality is moving. But in modernity, there is this enormous change, and Kant is working out on a metaphysical plane what people like Hobbes and Bacon and others have said. When Hobbes says, there is no utmost aim, such as the old moral philosophers used to argue. Life is the pursuit of power after power until death, right? Power. Because there are no genuine ends of our desire, right? So what you want, if there are no genuine ends, then what you want is the power in order to give yourself any particular end you may want at that time. So power is more important than actuality. Potentiality is more important than actuality. That is being worked out. That thought on the political level is being worked out on the metaphysical level by Kant. Potentiality is higher than actuality. So therefore we go from the fact that we do experience things to look at, well, what's the metaphysical ground? What's the condition for that possibility? Okay. Okay, so it's the subjective condition of our having sensibility, the subjective condition for the possibility of anything to be sensed, under which alone outer intuition is possible for us. For us, as opposed, there might be beings that don't need sense perception. Okay, so that's that.
Intuition is sensibility.
Yes, yes.
I came to this course thinking of it as something quite different.
Yes, yes.
No need to
it doesn't mean a refined understanding of Matisse. It means, that's right. And this is again where he differs from, he and most of the moderns differ from the classical tradition, that the only intuition is sensible intuition. But sensible intuition has a pure a priori form, space. So a priori means prior to anything sensed, the form is already in us, in a sense. Now, the consequence of that is in the middle of B43. And he says, since we cannot make, I'm going to highlight it on the text online, but I don't know what I can do if you're following. So this is 3 or 4 lines down from where it says B43 in the margin. He says, since we cannot make the special conditions of sensibility into conditions of the possibility of things. So what he means is, we can't make, what is a condition for us to experience something, that is to experience something in space, that's not a condition for the thing itself, that's a condition for us to experience it. Does that make sense? Right, so since we can't do that, so we can only make that, it says, but only of their appearances. So our special condition is a condition only of the manifestation of the thing to us. So its appearance to us. It's not a condition of the thing itself, whatever that is. Okay, so then he says, we can well say that space comprehends all things that may appear to us externally, but not all things in themselves. That's the key phrase. Right? Whether they be intuited or not, or by whatever subject they may be intuited. Okay, so this is so the argument has 2 parts. One, what condition makes possible the fact that we do experience things in space? Well, there's an a priori form, but that a priori form is due to us as the subject to experience that object. So second step is, our constitution of our experience bars us from knowing what the thing is in itself, because it's merely our capacity of experiencing it as spatial and as temporal, as we'll get to. I just want to bring out that point, because this key reorientation occurs in the transcendental aesthetic, and it's the basis for everything that follows. Now, just to repeat, I think we might have looked at this, but this is well worth repeating. This is the beginning of B44, where he says, our expositions. Now, he's said before, I am providing you with a transcendental exposition. The explanation of a concept as a principle from which insight into the possibility of other synthetic a priori conditions can be gained, blah, blah. So this transcendental aesthetic is a transcendental exposition. It's a transcendental philosophy, meaning what he is asserting is that this is the truth, right? And the truth is that things are empirically real and transcendentally ideal and so on, right? But this is the truth. This is not, as he says in the preface, I'm not offering you an opinion, right? I just want to make that very clear, because it's everything depends upon our accepting that. And as he says, like in the preface, the author can only present things to the reader as a judge, but he obviously thinks he has an open and shut case. So our expositions accordingly teach the reality, i.e. objective reality, so that is an object for us with our special constituting capacities is objectively real, right? The reality of space in regard to everything that can come before us externally as an object, but at the same time the ideality of space in regard to things when they are considered in themselves through reason, that is, without taking account of the constitution of our sensibility, which is spatio-temporal. Okay? So things are objectively real, that is, they have a universal and necessary constitution that any human being whose cognitive apparatus is working well will see. That this is a chair, that's a law of physics, and so on. But that is ideal. It's an ideal of human reason. It's only objectively real for a human being. Okay. So that we therefore assert the empirical reality of space with respect to all possible outer experience, though to be sure its transcendental ideality, that it is nothing as soon as we leave aside the condition of the possibility of all experience and take it as something that grounds the things in themselves. Right. So this is what Kant is doing. The same transcendental teaching that preserves the objectivity of science, which he's trying to preserve from the empiricism of Hume and so on, that same teaching blocks us from saying that we are in touch with the beings in themselves. Now, yeah, you could say, as Churchill said in a different context, he is lowering the goals in order to guarantee success. But that would be cynical. Now, I just want to read, if we just read a couple more paragraphs from the aesthetic.
Martin,
yeah.
can I ask a question?
Please.
With respect to the thing in itself, is he here saying that we can know that through reason?
That's exactly, no, he wants to deny that possibility, yeah?
He wants to deny that.
Okay. Yeah. So, and you know how, ideas are sensible, or they're concepts of the understanding, or they're ideas of reason. Now, the sensible ideas come to us through sense perception as organized by the a priori forms of space and time. The concepts of the understanding constitute those experiences so that we can then say that's a chair, this is a human, and so on. That's a concept, it's not a sensible thing. Humanity. Now, the ideas of reason do not have direct contact with things, and therefore, that's why when he discusses reason at some length, he calls that chapter the logic of illusion. There is no theoretical understanding of reason of anything in itself, or of anything that it's derivative from our understanding and sense perception. But then the shift he makes is, and this will come next week when we get to the canon of pure reason, the shift he makes is that whilst there is no theoretical access of reason to things, there is, in the moral, practical realm, reason has a role. In fact, a constituting role, which then directs all of the science that we've just been through. Yeah.
Right, but can I just ask, with respect to the thing in itself, does Kant not say something about that rather than nothing at all?
He says you can. It's necessary to think it, but it cannot perceive it. You can't, and the translation we have is cognition for this main word that he's using all the time for a perception or a recognition, so you cannot cognize it, right? It must be there. Otherwise, there wouldn't be something giving us sense perception. But he is arguing that because sense perception is constituted by is the form of our sensibility, that both makes it objectively valid and prevents us from knowing the thing in itself. Because there could be a being that doesn't need our sense perception.
Okay, thank you.
Could I suggest also that then the a priori
Yeah.
in general isn't a thing?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's very good, actually. So another one of the key words is like when he's saying that the a priori form of sensibility, he's completely changing the way form is used. Because again, in the tradition, the form of something is the intelligible character. It's what it is that you can see. Like this is a human being, that's an artifact, that's sunlight, and so on. Like what something is intelligible as well as sensible. The form is the most important part because that's the intelligible character. It's not the matter that makes up the thing. You know, it's not the atom streaming through the space that then we cognize as light or whatever it is, the leaf, the human being. So the most important thing is the intelligible character. That's the thing in itself, right? The matter that makes it up is more or less accidental and so on. It's changing over time. Now, that's the older view. Now he's using form, it's got nothing to do with an actual thing, right? It's our capacity of thinking about it. How did you put it, Cameron? About the a priori.
The a priori in general is not a thing.
Yeah, right. But it's our capacity to think a thing, right? So that means the form itself has no individuating character, yeah? The form of space does not tell us anything about any particular spatial being, right? It's the condition for the possibility of there being a spatial thing for us. Would you agree with that formulation, or would you?
I think so. Yeah, I don't know.
But it has to be a thing insofar as it's a faculty. Like there is something that is explaining how this is all working and doing this activity. No?
It's a truth that there are a priori capacities, yes. He is saying that there's an a priori capacity of sensibility called space. Okay?
Perfectly incoherent.
I think the reason why people find it persuasive, and I think its power, is when he does say what you do experience spatial things. None of them is space, they're all spatial. That means we have a capacity. What is the condition for the possibility of our cognizing something that's spatial? Well, it's that
maybe you need to add that it's not a thing in itself.
Yeah, but I mean, it still sounds as though Kant is doing the thing that Nietzsche laughs about, you know, how do you explain something? Well, there's a faculty for it. Like there's some mechanism which is making it happen, and all you need to do is understand the faculty.
And if Nietzsche's own basic teaching wasn't completely incredible, then we could proceed down that route. But for the moment, I know I make trans historical remarks all the time, but just to minimise the.
Martin, can I just? This is really interesting. So, could it be that the a priori is something like it's a relationship between human beings and the things and the phenomena? Because if there isn't that relationship, there's no knowledge of phenomena.
Or a formal relationship.
I'm sorry?
A formal one.
Yeah.
Yes. We have a posteriori, so given with experience or with sense perception, and a priori relations to the object. The a priori relation is the condition for the possibility of our experiencing it. So it's not a thing in itself. It's not a thing, right? It's a capacity. It's a field for the experience of things. I just want to read a couple more bits on time, and then we'll go on. But hopefully that will also develop this notion that Chris and Cameron have just suggested. So this is, where are we? This is in B47. In the middle of B47, there's a number 4 and then a bracket. And he says, time is no discursive, or as one calls it, general concept. So a general concept is discursive. That is, it can be expressed in a judgment. Right? So, and the thinking that constitutes things is conceptual, that is discursive, because we reject the notion of intellectual intuition. Okay, so time is no discursive, or as one calls it, general concept, but a pure form of sensible intuition. So we have sensible intuition, this red thing, that white thing, that warm sun, right? But it has a form. Where are we? Yeah, but it has a form, or otherwise put, in this case, we experience things in time, and that temporal order is part of our making sense of things. Now, then he says, different times are only part of one and the same time. Time is homogeneous. Right? So, but that means it must, well, in this case, he's arguing that it's therefore a form, a homogeneous general form. Different times are only parts of one and the same time. That representation, however, which can only be given through a single object, is an intuition. So the idea that we have of something, which comes from perceiving it, relies upon the fact that we intuit sensibly it before us. Right? Further, and that's singular, not universal. Further, the proposition that different times cannot be simultaneous cannot be derived from a general concept. So he's saying that time is neither a concept nor intuited sensibly, time itself. Yeah, I know that's really easy to understand. Now, but let me hasten on to section 6, the conclusions he draws from this. So this is at B49, the beginning of section. Sorry,
Martin. Before you go on, may I ask something?
sure.
It's about Kant's thinking of time. So, is Kant's thinking of time similar to Aristotle's thinking of time, and our general understanding of time being a series of nows?
No, and but Aristotle doesn't want to say that either, I don't think. But we're going to read a couple more lines on time. So let's see if that helps, and if it doesn't help, please, let's pursue it. So at the beginning of section 6, he says, time is not something that would subsist for itself or attach to things as an objective determination, and thus remain if one abstracted from all subjective conditions of the intuition of them. Okay, time is not a thing, right, that attaches to things and that would be there if they were not being sensed by a being that senses things in time.
Sorry, where are we at?
We're at B49, and there's a section 6 where he says conclusions from these concepts.
Okay. Thanks.
Now I'm going to run ahead to B51, the beginning of B51. In fact, the very line where B51 begins, and he says, "If I can say a priori," so he takes himself. I'm providing truths that are a priori. Okay? They're based on the possibility of the fact that we have sense experience, but they're truths that are not derived from sense experience. They're derived from the condition of the possibility of sense experience. So if I can say a priori all outer appearances are in space and determined a priori according to the relations of space, so from the principle of inner sense, that is time, I can say entirely generally, all appearances in general, that is, all objects of the senses are in time and necessarily stand in relations of time. Right. Now, from that, I want to go down to B52, the beginning of B52. where he says, the line before B52, we cannot say all things are in time or things are in time, because with the concept of things in general, abstraction is made from every kind of intuition of them. Right? If you're talking about things, okay, but this is the real condition under which time belongs to the representation of objects. Now, if the condition is added to the concept and the principle says that all things as appearances, objects of sensible intuition, are in time, then the principle has its sound objective correctness and a priori universality. Simple?
You're saying that, if I've got it, things are not in time, but things as appearances are in time.
Right, and we only have access to the appearance, so we can then deduce from that that there's an a priori formal capacity of temporalizing things that belongs to our way of experiencing things. But that very fact that things that we experience must necessarily be in a relation of time that has an objective validity, that very fact precludes our knowing things in themselves. Because we've just admitted that we constitute the experience through our particular forms of sensibility. You're going to protest that?
So, I mean, all right, so Kant seems to be saying that we can and can't say. There's a lot of rules being put down here about what can be and can't be said about things.
Yes.
But if, and I understand that we're not going to get there by perception, and we need the deduction, the process of deduction to get to these things. But he still wants to name these things and describe them with these rule-like properties, which...
Yeah. Which things? The things in themselves, or
the
a
priori conditions for the possibility of perception.
Yeah.
He wants to describe those as having rule-like properties, which makes them awfully like things, and that's what.
How are they like things, therefore?
Well, because they have constraints. They've got, they've got internal rules about.
Yeah, but a rule for the possibility of thinking something is different from something.
Yeah. Okay. Maybe. Yep.
He says, like, if there's no being sensing things in space and time, there's no space and time, because that a priori form of time and space are not things. They're capacities that allow us to perceive things.
Yeah.
Right? I'm using, that's my speech, which doesn't have his authority. There are, in his language, they are a priori forms of sensibility. But just to explain that, it's our way of, the way the world is given to our capacities is through space and time, which as our capacities form things in space and time, and which may not be the only ways, and may not, and yeah.
No, they are the only way.
Well, for us. No, but they're not the only ways. This is the whole problem. There could be a rational being that understands things directly, but that's not us. This is what he's attempting to say. Sorry, Cameron, did you?
No, I did.
We have a couple more lines on time and space, and then we'll head to the much simpler part of the transcendental deduction of the pure categories of the understanding. So, yes.
I think it is worth addressing Peter's point. Like, what are we talking about? What's time?
It's a pure a priori form of the sensibility. I thought that was obvious. Yeah, no,
it's not out there.
Yeah. No, this, but
In respect of space, though, I don't know about time, but in respect of space is the form of the sensible, sensible outer sense.
Yeah.
But at the same time, as it is the form of outer sense, it also can be given to us in objects. I believe I've read something. So there is. I don't know if that applies to the same extent with time, insofar as time is the form of our inner intuition, but
And our
I don't know whether he says that in experience we are given time in thought, say for example, or I'm grasping at something that I don't quite understand there.
Your first point about space, can you just...
Give me a minute and I'll try and find it.
Okay, yeah, okay. Where are we? So, the last line I want to read is, let's say second last. The second last line I want to read is B55, a few lines before B56. There's a paragraph beginning, time and space are accordingly two sources of cognition, from which different synthetic cognitions can be drawn a priori, of which especially pure mathematics in regard to the cognitions of space, geometry, and its relations provide a splendid example. So they're sources of cognition, they're a priori forms, they're not things. That's... But one more passage. And further on here, just after B56, he says, but these a priori sources of cognition determine their own boundaries by the very fact that they are merely conditions of sensibility, namely that they apply to objects only so far as they are considered as appearances but do not present things in themselves. So that's the point that I'm trying to insist on, that he is saying this thing, this capacity that gives us objective validity of the things that we experience in space and time, and by that very same thought precludes us from having theoretical knowledge of things in themselves. And that's the first step. Okay, one more couple of lines and we'll get immediately to something far harder. So this is in B59. B59, and we're in the middle of the paragraph, and I need to find a sentence that begins. Just difficult to find the... Okay, I'm going to have to read from the beginning of the second paragraph where he says, we have therefore, because it's a long sentence. We have therefore wanted to say that all our intuition is nothing but the representation, the ideas of appearance. That the things that we intuit are not in themselves what we intuit them to be, because our sensible form, the form of our sensibility, is not access to the thing in itself. It forms the object for us and precludes us from knowing the thing in itself, right? So that the things that we intuit are not in themselves what we intuit them to be, nor are their relations so constituted in themselves as they appear to us. And that if we remove our own subject, or even only the subjective constitution of the senses in general, then all constitution, all relation of objects in space and time, indeed, space and time themselves, would disappear. And as appearances, they cannot exist in themselves, but only in us. Right? So that's the two sides of this teaching about the transcendental aesthetic. We have a priori forms that for us order things in space and time. But if you take away us, then there's no things ordered in space and time. It's a subjective capability. It's not something in the things themselves. Okay. So then he says, last sentence, what may be the case with objects in themselves and abstracted from all this receptivity of our sensibility remains entirely unknown to us. Now, this is the first step to say, I am preserving the universality and necessity of mathematical physics. I am saving science from being merely the empirical view that we abstract things from accidental sensible phenomena and build up a universal, which you can't do. You can't build a universal and a necessity out of accidental phenomena. And I'm preserving science from that. First step. The second step is the moral program to say we have access to the thing in itself, not insofar as it is the case, and we have theoretical knowledge, we have access to what ought to be the case, and moral knowledge or practical knowledge. That's part 2, which is not given emphasis for 650 pages. And in all the literature, people get tired and faint before they get to the end. So it's not emphasized, but that's the whole key, right? That's the whole key to this whole project. Okay, so I know that's a lengthy background to what we're doing today. And I think I wanted to begin with page 100, B 129 to 30 from memory. Correct me if I'm wrong. Let me just get that reference. Oh. Right. Yeah, we've done that. Yeah, B 139, 129 to 30.
29.
Yeah, B 129 to 30. And in the B text, not the A text. Where are we? We're in B. Okay, that's good. Now, this is called, B129, which opens a new chapter of the deduction of the pure concepts of the understanding. So the transcendental aesthetic was about the a priori or transcendental concept form of our sensibility. The deduction of the pure concepts of the understanding is not a deduction as in I start with the first being and deduce consequences, which medieval philosophers sometimes did. Right? He means if we have experience of objects, then I can deduce from that we must have pure concepts of understanding that constitute those objects. And those particular objects, this human being, that sunlight, is constituted by sensibility on the one hand and conceptual understanding on the other. Okay, so then we'll read the first paragraph or so at the beginning of this chapter. So on the possibility of a combination in general. Now, why that becomes important will be soon be made manifest. The manifold of representations can be given in an intuition that is merely sensible. Yeah, that is nothing but receptivity. The only receptivity we have is sensible, according to his teaching. And the form of this intuition can lie a priori in our faculty of representation without being anything other than the way in which the subject is affected. So what he's recapitulating, right? If we experience something sensibly, it is formed in space and time by our faculties of space and time, our a priori transcendental faculties of space and time. And that's why he says these a priori faculties are nothing other than the way in which the subject is affected. So that's our intuition, that's how we are affected by things being in space or time, that we form in space and time. Now, but when we do that, we have to form particular things. So how do we account for the fact that it's not just an immense buzzing noise of thousands of points of white, light, cream, black, red, and so on, that we then form into beings? This is where it's coming to. Yet the combination, conjunctio, of a manifold in general can never come to us through the senses, because all we sense is the different colours, shapes, textures, and so on. So that the combination of a manifold doesn't come through the senses and therefore cannot already be contained in the pure form of sensible intuition. So that the pure form of sensible intuition, space and time, don't combine things into things. For it is an act, right? And he's using this language deliberately. It's a translation not of actus, so in the Latin translation of Aristotle, actual energeia or entelecheia is translated as actus or act. It's the actuality of a thing. But he's putting the actuality of the thing in the mind, as we'll see from the rest of the sentence. For it is the act of the spontaneity, the free constituted power, right? The spontaneity of the power of representation. And since one must call the latter understanding, in distinction from sensibility, all combination, whether we are conscious of it or not, whether it is a combination of the manifold of intuition or of several concepts, and in the first case, either of sensible or non-sensible intuition, is an action of the understanding, which we would designate with the general title synthesis, in order at the same time to draw attention to the fact that we can represent nothing as combined in the object without having previously combined it ourselves. Okay, this is a long sentence, just stopping for a moment, right? Every unity derives from an act of the mind. I'm just translating, so if it's inaccurate, please pull me up. But there's no unity that we perceive, right, in the things themselves. Now, if you want to go to Plato's Phaedo, page 96 to 97 in the Stephanus numbers, the key to Socrates in Plato hypothesizing that things have an intelligible character is the problem of unity, because he investigates things as if you could break them down into their material, or you could enumerate them and manipulate them with mathematics, or that they are under the power of a cosmological good. He rejects all of that because of the problem of unity. And what we perceive is particular things unified in a particular way, and his word for that is eidos, or form. Now, this is the contrary view. All combination is not the perception of a unity in the things, it's constituted by the understanding itself. We somehow make all unity. Yeah. I'm putting this in my own terms, so it's always safest to stick with Kant's own expressions, but just to try and give you a sense. Okay, so then he says, and that among all representations, combination is the only one that is not given through objects, but can be executed only by the subject itself, since it is an act of its self-activity. So now the mind becomes, so in the older view, the mind has two aspects. One, passive, the other, active. Passive, the reception of the character of things. Active, when you infer and discuss and think about those things. In this view, the mind is only active, right? And it constitutes the unity of everything, which means it constitutes things as the kind of being that they are, right? Now, how do we do that? Because the sense perception is particular. This red object attached to these grey objects, I constitute as a single unity a chair. How does that happen? How do we have the universal concept? The concept is universal, right? The sense perception is particular. How do we constitute our apprehension of things, which are both? We never meet something that we say that we can't say it's X or Y. It's something. Precisely when you can't quite make something out, that's when you're puzzled, because you can always make out something to be something. Right? So, and that means it's a combination of particularity and universality in some way. I'm just using language in an abbreviated way. Okay. Now.
Just picking up on the discussion last week, I'd hesitate to say the concept is universal. I think that in some respects it's the category which needs to be considered as universal, whereas the concept of a chair is a concept in general, a judgment that gathers together different representations of an object.
Yeah.
So that just given this idea of other cultural understandings of objects, it gives that more space for its own validity. Whereas to say that a concept is universal, I feel like that cuts off potentially other cultural ways of viewing objects.
We are cutting them off.
I feel like the a priori categories operates with that respect to cut that off.
Yeah.
But concepts themselves are many and varied, and the concept of an object can exist in any culture.
Okay, so our experience of the meaning of things will be different in different cultures. I mean, this is a word actually that derives from Kant. Yeah. Now, he thinks there is one truth about how we experience things, as we saw in the transcendental aesthetic. I am giving you the transcendental, he uses the term transcendental exposition. Now, he also thinks that he does that in the moral realm as well, right? Which is the realm of principles or what we now call values and so on. So therefore, when you have a particular culture that encourages you to value certain things in a certain way, they will be more or less true representations of that singular moral truth, right? And there may be a varieties of way to maybe take it into the realm of beauty for a moment. There are varieties of different ways. Like we all know that there are many different cultures that have made very beautiful artifacts of radically different kinds, yeah? But they all exhibit beauty. And so he's saying, I know what beauty is and I know what morality is. You may express it more or less effectively, more or less fully with this particular cultural artifact or cultural way of life, yeah. But the concepts are universal. This is my suggestion for how I think he's explaining things. But are you saying?
I'm saying that the way I feel I have to understand it is that the categories are universal, not the concepts.
And you're talking about different sort of levels of or orders of concept too. Like beauty is not the same thing as a chair. These are, you know, there's a confusion there.
No, beauty's not the same thing as a chair.
So what are we calling concept?
Sorry, maybe we should just leave this and keep.
No, I think it's important.
So what the person in white there? What do you mean by category? What do you mean by category?
Oh, the categories that are deduced by Kant, the forms of all thinking in general. Is that right? Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, but he then deduces from them, from our capacity for judgment, and the various categories of that are exhibited by judgment, the universal concepts of the understanding. That's my understanding. But let's keep this open as a question, and hopefully we can make further progress towards making sense of it. Yeah.
Martin, can I ask a question? Before you said you were talking about the concept of the meaning of things, and it was a Kantian term. What's the term you were thinking of there? You said it's Kant's term.
Well, no, Kant. Well,
It's culture.
Oh, culture, was it?
yeah.
Oh,
He's the
okay.
first person to use the term in its modern sense.
Okay, thank you.
Before it became relative, I mean, now we say cultures, right? But when Kant uses it, well, I think it's not a perpetual piece. It's one of the other late essays.
Okay,
He means it in the culture of the mind. Right?
Thank you.
And that's part of that, the enlightenment. If you're going to have an enlightenment, it means that everyone needs to be able to understand the truth. And Kant is saying that's possible because we can all understand the basic truths of morality. As to quote him from the groundwork of the metaphysics of morals, any well-brought-up 8-year-old. Now, problem is, you've squeezed a lot into that concept, right? Any well brought up, that means in a particular way, right? But that's this whole very complicated epistemological apparatus is developed to guarantee a common goal. So it's not like Aristotle or Plato who want to know the truth, and if you can follow them, you can follow them. If you can't, they deliberately try to exclude you by arguing in an obscure manner. That's different from this. This is a universal teaching. But if you have a universal teaching, then you have to exclude all the errors. As I mentioned in the first handout, they must be destroyed. The questions against the transcendental understanding must be destroyed. Otherwise your enlightenment will revert to barbarism from this point of view. That's the difficulty of an enlightenment teaching. Okay, so, yeah. Let's go on. So this is still in B130, last two lines on our translation on the page. He says, one can here easily see that this action must originally be unitary and equally valid for all combination, and that the dissolution, and dissolution is a possible translation of analysis, right? That seems to be its opposite. In fact, always presupposes it. Okay, now by saying that, one can easily see here that this action must always be unitary. If we impart all the unity to every aspect of our experience, we impart that action must itself be unitary. Right? The action which constitutes the intelligibility of things has to itself be unified, otherwise it wouldn't be a coherent experience. Did you want? No. Okay, but that unity does not belong to the things, just to make that very clear. The unity does not belong to the things, it belongs to the capacity that forms the things. So as I said before, the word form, which meant unity, is now transferred to the mind, which constitutes the character of things. Right? And so he is saying that all analysis presupposes this prior combination. And that will be right. If he's right that the mind constitutes things, then any analysis is an analysis that proceeds after a synthesis, after a combination. Whereas that was precisely the point that Plato's Socrates is making in the Phaedo, that analysis presupposes the unity of the thing perceived. But he's off on this different track. But that's the incredibly significant choice. It's one or the other. We either can perceive the unity of things or we constitute it. For where the understanding has not previously combined anything, neither can it dissolve anything. For only through it can something have been given to the power of representation as combined. Right? Only through our own constituting power can we see something as combined. Now, I very much want to read the passage where he says, sense perception without concepts are blind, and concepts without sense perception are empty. Does anyone happen to know off the top of their head the B number?
Yeah.
Sorry.
Okay, so I'll find that in the break, which we should immediately have. 103. Yeah, so we've taken enough. So 10 minutes. And because there may be people coming into this room at 2, so after the break, if at any point after the break, it'd be good if you want to raise your particular question, just so I don't exclude them by talking too much towards the end. So 10 minutes break. Okay, so at B93, where shall we start?
Is this the logical employment of the understanding?
The
analytic of concepts?
Yeah.
On the clue to the discovery of all pure concepts. Now, a pure concept would have to be universal, yeah? A pure concept is not affected by sensibility. But you're quite rightly raising the fact that the word concept for us does not necessarily imply a universal. Is that right?
And also I was going to suggest that in my view, the domain of the empirical experience for Kant is wide and varied, so that there may be many concepts for many different representations of objects in that limited sense.
Yeah. What I think he's saying is that the way he uses concept, it's definitely universal, When we have experience, though, that universal concept, which is one, is mediated into a potential infinity, because the fact that you have a unitary concept of human being does not take account of all the radical differences among all different human beings, but they're all human beings. So when you make the judgment, this is a human being, it's going to be, or this human being is X, Y, and Z. That will be different for any other human being. So the universal concept doesn't prescribe the particular, but I think he's using concept in a way that we now, obviously, we relativize everything. So he uses culture to mean the culture of the mind. We now say cultures. He uses concept to mean these universals that apply to experience. We mean opinion, like just a much more varied notion. But let's look at this passage that you brought up. So if I start from now the understanding can make no other use of, concepts, of these concepts than that of judging by means of them. Sorry, I'll start before that. I'm going to start all the way back at B93, about line 4. He says, all intuitions as sensible rest on affections, that is, being affected, right? Pathological, being affected. Concepts, therefore, on functions, that is, acts of thinking. By a function, however, I understand the unity of the action of ordering different representations under a common one. So that's what he's talking about in the passage we read before, that it's the activity of the understanding to order and unify different representations. So these different colours and so on into a chair or whatever. Concepts are therefore, but you do that with the concept of universal concepts like body, red. Concepts are therefore grounded on the spontaneity of thinking, as sensible intuitions are grounded on the receptivity of impressions. So the fact that we can, we take in colour is the ground of our sensible intuition, and the fact that we can spontaneously act upon and unify representations is the ground of our having concepts. Now, the understanding can make no other use of these concepts than that of judging by means of them. That is, this is a human, that's a good human, that's a bad human, and so on. Since no representation pertains to the object immediately except intuition alone. So by immediately, he means that in the precise sense that nothing else mediates between the object and us. Nothing is without mediation. Everything else is mediated. The only immediate contact we have with things is through the senses. Okay. A concept is thus never immediately related to an object, but is always related to some other representation of it, whether that be an intuition or itself already a concept. So a concept is related to the fact that we have ideas of colour, space, and so on. The colour, the spatial location of a thing, its hardness, and so on. Judgment is therefore the immediate cognition of an object, hence the representation of a representation of it. We have an object which has particular colours, shapes, size, right? We make a judgment, this is a human being, and that's a mediation between the particular sense perception and the universal concept. In every judgment there is a concept that holds of many, so the judgment holds of many, because there are many human beings, say, and that among this many comprehends a given representation, which is then related immediately to the object. Now, don't faint, but he's going to give us an example. So, in the judgment, for example, all bodies are divisible. That's a judgment. The concept of the divisible, this universal concept of divisibility, is related to various other concepts, that is, bodies. Among these, however, it is here particularly related to the concept of body, and this in turn related to certain appearances that come before us, i.e. things that appear in space. So this is why I'm trying to say that the concept is the universal that has no immediate relation to anything. It's mediated by judgments about particular things which are sensed. So sensibility, judgment, conceptual understanding. But he's using concept in this very rarefied sense, not the way I think that you mean it, that is the conceptual understanding of the world as having this value and so on, the lived experience more. That, yeah, I think, so that's, we're using the word concept in a a more relativized sense. But I wanted to go back, and thank you for pointing out where this is. That's on page, it's on B75. But I might start at B74, the beginning of this chapter, just because it sets out something that's helpful. So it's the beginning of the idea of a transcendental logic, which is the beginning of the second part of the transcendental doctrine of elements. He says, our cognition, so our perception of things, arises, and in the other translation, our knowledge of things, our perception, our cognition arises from two fundamental sources in the mind, the first of which is the reception of representations, the reception of impressions, sense perceptions. The second, the faculty of for cognizing an object, okay? Because strictly speaking, you don't really have an object until you've cognized it. By means of these representation, the spontaneity of concepts. The spontaneity is the activity of the mind to conceive something. Through the former, that is through sense perception, the object is given to us. Through the latter, it is thought. It's not thought until we apply concepts to it, in relation to that sensible representation that is given to us as a mere determination of the mind, i.e. the mind is affected or determined by the sense perception, but we determine the object. So intuition and concepts, sensible intuition, concepts of the understanding, therefore constitute the elements of all our cognition, okay, of all of our perception. So that neither concepts without intuition corresponding to them in some way, nor intuition without concepts can yield a cognition. Now, if we come down further to B75, the beginning of this paragraph, if we will call the receptivity of our mind to receive representations insofar as it is affected in some way, sensibility. So this is repetitious. The only thing given to us is sensible, sense impressions. Then, on the contrary, the faculty for bringing forth representations itself, or the spontaneity of cognition, is the understanding. It comes along with our nature that intuition can never be other than sensible. There are passages in the text where he says, you, Plato, wrongly say that there is intuition of an intellectual kind. So he's taking direct opposition to what I've been saying about this is the classical way of things, is that you have an intelligible and sensible aspect to your intuition. But he understands Plato in a very Neoplatonist way as to think is to make. And so he thinks that, his reply to Plato is that if intellectual intuition would be only possible for a God that created the world. Now that's revealing of the fact that A, he's never read Plato, and B, he understands thinking to be genuine only if you make the thing. Only if you make it do you really know it, and that's like a modern theme. It's in Hobbes and others that we know genuinely what we make, whereas the classical view is that if you make everything, you can't know anything. You're making blind, right? Making is subordinate to seeing. If you can't see what you're doing, you don't know what you're making, right? Okay, but I won't, getting off track there. Okay, so coming back to Kant at 4 lines down in this paragraph, he says, it comes along with our nature that intuition can only be sensible, that it contains only the way in which we are affected by objects. The faculty for thinking of objects of sensible intuition, on the contrary, is the understanding. I think these two paragraphs could have been conflated and written in a third of the space, but here we are. Neither of these properties is to be preferred to the other. Without sensibility, no object would be given to us, and without understanding, none would be thought. thoughts without content are empty. Intuitions without concepts are blind. Now, this is quoted in all the textbooks because it seems powerful. But what does he mean here by blind? By blind, he doesn't mean not being able to see, right? Does he? Because that's sensible. He's using sight as a metaphor for knowing. But sight is not his metaphor for knowing. His metaphor is concept, which comes from concipere, which is to grasp. We can have actual knowledge of things that we constitute. Right? But here, he reverts to the classical metaphor for knowing, which is seeing. There must be an aspect of seeing that precedes all making. Otherwise, you don't know, like I just said, you don't know what you're making. So your constructive, like we construct concepts and thoughts and ideas and opinions, but we do that in the light of what we see, which is why occasionally we say to someone we're talking with, do you see what I mean? I've tried several different sentence constructions. I've tried 4 different languages and an image to get you to see something because the sight is prior to all of these images of what I want you to see. That's the old...
Martin, and doesn't that suggest that the classical way of thinking still has a hold on Kant?
That was my suggestion, yes. That's what I'm suggesting, that he he's forced to use that metaphor. Okay, but I wanted to read that because it's a basic sentence that everyone quotes, and there's some power to it because you don't think things until you have. Well, he says concepts, but I would either that or intellectual intuition. Yeah. Sorry, did you want to introduce Hegel or?
No.
Good.
No, I mean, this is obviously a very important part. Like the 2 things have to happen at once.
Yes.
And this is where I think, this is why, the spontaneity of, I don't know, apprehension, whatever it is, spontaneity is so important for Kant, right? Like, this is going to save him from the completely absurd position, which seems to be, riddled through everything that we've read, that Kant seems to have been telling us that we need to understand our experience as relying on an experience that we can't have. Now, we experience the manifold in all its blinking, twisting, blindness, but that's not our experience. Like, that's what we can't experience because we have the faculty
because we conceptualize it.
Because we conceptualize it.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So why insist on it?
Why insist?
I mean, no, how is that not absurd?
That
It's necessary, I think, would it be? Or because it's necessary? Or?
Well, yeah, I mean, he's saying that because our experience is ordered, there are necessary conditions for that orderedness.
But you can't get to the manifold from there. Like you have to presume it. Like the story about how.
Well, okay, but in and I'm not trying to put him in his time, but the argument had been made by Locke and Hume that the given is impressions, sense impressions.
Yes.
Bits of red, bits of grey, and we abstract from that. Oh, I've seen enough red chairs to know this is red, and that's madness. Like you can't derive from this multiplicity of sense perceptions a thing that you can then apply. It's just very difficult, this notion of abstraction. And so he is saying no. Our sense perceptions must be ordered. That's why he calls a concept a rule or a function. And then now we are going to read now some paragraphs where he tries to explain how this works and says, how is it that we get from the universal concept to the judgment, this is a dog? Right, so we're going to get there, I hope. Okay, so next passage is where? This, yeah. let's go, we'll just read a couple of lines at the very beginning of B176, and then we're going to go a little bit further into that chapter. Transcendental doctrine of the power of judgment, or analytic of principles. First chapter, on the schematism of the pure concepts of the understanding. We have pure, universal, and necessary concepts. Now the schematism is how those concepts get applied to the sense perception. So we're trying to deal with this problem. And he begins by saying, in all subsumptions of an object under a concept, say body, as he said before, the representation of the former, the object, must be homogeneous with the latter. That is, the concept must contain that which is represented in the object that is to be subsumed under it, for that is just what it is meant by the expression, an object is subsumed under a concept. Now, revolution, we're going to have a second example. I think from my memory, there are probably 9 examples in this book, and we've had 2 of them today, so I hope you're feeling spoiled. So, thus, the empirical concept of a plate has homogeneity with the pure geometrical concept of a circle. Empirical concept. So an empirical concept combines sensibility and conceptual understanding. So that's a plate, right? And he's saying that concept of a plate has homogeneity with the pure geometrical concept of a circle, for the roundness that is thought in the former, in the plate, can be intuited in the latter, in the circle. So we have the pure concept of a circle, which is mediated by the judgment, that's a plate, or the empirical concept of a plate. Now, how do we get from our sense perception of the white round thing, or the white thing, that we then define as being using the universal concept of roundness and so on, and end up defining it as a plate, which is a particular kind of thing, with particular kinds of uses. That's what he's going to try and explain in this chapter. Now, if we look at B177, so we're just going over the page. In the middle of B177, he says, now it is clear that there must be a third thing which must stand in homogeneity with the category on the one hand and the appearance on the other, and make possible the application of the former, the category, say roundness, to the latter, this white thing. So we can say plate. This mediating representation must be pure, without anything empirical. It's not spatial or temporal, yet intellectual on the one hand and sensible on the other. Such a representation is the transcendental, i.e. a priori or pure, schema. Now, schema is a Greek word for figure. So it's another word for image. This is unfortunate for Kant, but he's not using it as an image. Now, if we go over the page, he gives us a bit more of a discussion of the schema. So at B179, about 3 lines down under B179, he says, we will call this formal and pure condition of the sensibility, to which the use of the concept of the understanding is restricted, the schema of this concept of the understanding, and we will call the procedure of the understanding with these schemata, just the plural of schema, the schematism of the pure understanding. I'm going to put this in simple but unreliable English. The application of concepts to things we sense is mediated by what he calls the schematism of the pure understanding, which is a function of what he calls imagination. Right, so imagination, you can imagine something that you're not sensing. So it's a priori, it's pure of empirical sense perception, yes? But what you imagine has intelligible character, but it's not the pure form of 5 or an elephant or whatever it is. It's a particular elephant or 5 things. So the imagination has both these elements. It's pure of sensibility, and it represents concretely the intelligible character of things. So the imagination, and this is actually completely wild, because we have this extremely comprehensive and extremely internally consistent system, as he explicitly describes all of his thought as a system. But it depends upon an act of the imagination that he is about to tell us is completely unknowable. Another one. So it's like Heidegger has all of this complicated discussions of being and blah, blah, blah. And then you get right down to it and he says, all of this is actually a mystery, which means not knowable. Okay, so I just find this remarkable that people at this level make this move. Okay, but we'll read some of this paragraph because it will help us see how he's trying to mediate between the sensibility and the intelligibility of things. So
Martin,
yeah,
you just made some quite controversial comments there.
I can quote chapter and verse. So
yeah, but when you're using the word knowable, what do you mean?
erkennen, erkenntnis, gignorskein, epistemi, any of those?
And in plain English?
No. Have knowledge of.
Come on. Pardon?
Have knowledge of. Have any kind of perception.
I guess what I'm trying to bring in is possibly the concept of cognition. So you're saying that you must know things for them to be to make any sense of things. Is that correct?
No, I didn't say that. What I said was, it's remarkable that people who elaborate a very conceptually intricate understanding of things then say that this all depends upon something that's not cognizable. I just find that there's a tension between those two, as opposed to a philosophy that says those things that are not cognizable are dealt with directly, and not in such a way as to undermine an apparently systematic exposition. So,
are you saying it's not cognizable because I shouldn't say relegating, but he's placing it. He's placing the schema. He is just articulating the schema as a product of the imagination.
Yes.
So the imagination itself is not a domain of knowledge. Is that
right.
what you mean?
We'll read the sentence where you're raising exactly the right point. If we read this paragraph at B180, he himself will elaborate what I'm seeing as a question. But so he says, in fact, it is not images of objects, but schemata. So he doesn't want to say we don't have concrete images that allow us to say, because if you did, it would be, you couldn't recognize a particular dog because your image is brown and not speckled or something. So it is not images, but schemata, which don't have that concreteness of an image, that ground our pure sensible concepts. No image of a triangle would ever be adequate to the concept of it, right? So the pure concept of a triangle, right, is not an image of an isosceles triangle, because there are other kinds of triangle, right? So it's not an image. Okay, that's on the one hand. No image of it, for it would not attain the generality of the concept, which makes this valid for all triangles, right-angled triangles, acute triangles, and so on, but would always be limited to one part of the sphere. So the mediating thing, the schematism, which mediates between the sensible particular and the universal concept, can't have the particularity of an image. The schema of the triangle can never exist anywhere except in thought, and signifies a rule of the synthesis of the imagination with regard to pure shapes in space. I'm sure that was fairly translucent. So the schema of the triangle, this mediating grasp, is only intellectual. It only exist in thought as a rule of the synthesis of the imagination. That is a rule with regards to synthesizing, that is putting together things in a particular way and saying that's a triangle. So it's a rule for comprehending something as something.
Would it be possible to step back a little bit and understand what he might mean by imagination?
Wait.
Yeah.
Because I can't do better than he's going to do immediately. Okay, even less does an object of experience or an image of it ever reach the empirical concept. Rather, the latter, the empirical concept, is always related immediately to the schema of the imagination, as a rule for the determination of our intuition in accordance with a certain general concept. The schema of the imagination is somehow a rule for saying this is a triangle, i.e. it falls under this general concept, and that's not a triangle. It doesn't fall under that general concept. The concept of a dog, and this is our third example today. We have a plethora, we're being flooded with illuminating examples. The concept of a dog signifies a rule in accordance with which my imagination can specify the shape of a four-footed animal in general. Now, can you do that? Can you specify the shape in general? Yeah. This is the difficulty he's facing. If it's too particular, it'll exclude dachshunds, right? If it's too general, it'll include cats, four-footed animal, right? And horses. And so, but somehow there's a mediation between the universal and the particular. This is the difficulty. Okay, so he says, the concept of a dog signifies a rule in accordance with which my imagination can specify the shape of a four-footed animal in general without being restricted to any single particular shape that experience offers me, or any possible image that I can exhibit in concreto, concretely. So any particular image which would exclude certain other kinds of dog. The schematism of our understanding with regard to appearances and their mere form is a hidden art in the depths of the human soul, whose true operations we can divine from nature and lay unveiled before our eyes only with difficulty. Right? So that's what I mean, like by saying his enormously perspicacious, systematic construction depends upon a hidden art in the depths of the human soul, which can only... Now, every philosopher begins with what's familiar to us to try to get to what's true in itself, which is not familiar to us, but it's the grounds for what's familiar to us. So I'm not criticizing that. I'm just saying it's a question.
I mean, that's kind of mundane in it might be that Kant is just simply saying there is a kind of creative work that the brain has to do when it's being spontaneously constructive of experience. And that creative work could be exactly the same thing as what Dali does, or some sort of diffusion technology. It's not magic. It's just deconstructing and reconstructing pictures,
yep,
or colours, or so I'm just saying, it's not magic. Possibly, it might be. I don't know. We could give him more credit.
Yeah, but he's wanting to say that we can understand our conceptual apparatus as constituting our experience.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Now to do that, there must be something like this. So in that case, fine. There must be something like this. Condition for the possibility and so on.
So in a sense, the schema is the possibility, or the schematism is the possibility for experience of the a priori.
Yeah, in which case the magic bit is that we've got a schema. Or that there is a schematism. It's not.
Well, as you say,
Yeah.
what's not magic is our experience, which is that we experience particular things of particular kinds. But how do we get the universal kind and the particular sense perception together? And he is saying through this capacity, the schematism.
Martin, can I just make two comments, sort of questions? So, is the sort of mysteriousness that you've just mentioned, is it really that far from the mysteriousness of the object of thinkers like St. Thomas Aquinas and Augustine, who wrote millions of words about their main object? So that's one. And the other one, just in relation to the dog. So if it's a four-footed animal which barks, and bark can be translated into every language on earth, say, then that's pretty precise, isn't it? Like a four-footed animal that barks, and that'll distinguish it from, the 3,000 other animals that make different noises or don't make noises.
You're discriminating against mute dogs.
Yeah.
And also, Chris, I could be on all my fours and barking. Does that make me a dog?
Oh, look, I don't want to answer that.
Okay, we are now going to go, usual slow, careful fashion to B55.
It's a big jump.
Yeah, B560. Now, look, next week I hope, and all of these your questions, not all of them, but most of them, are trying to make sense of this in a broader way. And next week that will be the focus, to try and make sense of things broadly after discussing the second part of the transcendental method, the canon of pure reason. Talk more broadly about how he's discussing our experience. What I wanted to do was very quickly look at a couple of paragraphs in this section where he is resolving the problem that we appear to have two completely rational understandings of the world that contradict each other. On the one hand, mathematical physics tells us that everything is determined by its previous physical state. And our apprehension of human beings' capacity to act well or badly implies that they could do otherwise, implies that human beings have some freedom and that they're not determined by their previous state. And those two are completely contradictory. Right, so he says this at the beginning of this at B560, at the beginning of this chapter, resolution of the cosmological idea of the totality of the derivation of occurrences in the world from their causes. In respect of what happens, one can think of causality in only two ways, whether according to nature or from freedom. The first is the connection of a state with a preceding one in the world of sense, upon which that state follows according to a rule. Now, this is the modern conception of a cause. So Aristotle had four causes. Right? One is the origin of motion of something, and that in the medieval period became called the efficient cause, i.e. the effective cause. So if a billiard ball hits another billiard ball, this is Hume's example, that's an efficient cause from Aristotle's point of view. But Aristotle also had a much broader notion of cause, and the efficient cause of any artifact is the maker. The efficient cause of a child is a parent, and so on. So it's much broader. But in modernity, we ignore the other three causes. Well, we don't ignore the material cause, but we ignore the formal and final cause. So for Aristotle, any living thing has a healthy state that it grows towards. Like that tree is reasonably healthy, but it has a number of brown leaves because it hasn't got sufficient water. And so that means that but it is growing towards a healthy state if the conditions allow it. That's natural. So for Aristotle, by nature, things tend towards a healthy or a good state. And that is excluded from this notion of nature here. So it's excluded from the modern understanding of nature, just to make that clear. Okay, so whereas in our understanding of nature, everything except for this narrow notion of an efficient cause is excluded. So he goes on. Now, since the causality of appearances rests on temporal conditions, because the cause of a thing that happens now is what happened, is what was earlier, and the preceding state, if it always existed, could not have produced any effects that first arose in time, the causality of the cause of what happens or arises has also arisen, and according to the principle of understanding, it in turn needs a cause. Another completely transparent so there can't be something outside the temporal chain that is a cause. I'm just going to say that as a summary. Now, next, by freedom in the cosmological sense, on the contrary, I understand the faculty of beginning a state from itself, not being caused by something else, right? So that was what he just excluded in the natural understanding of, in the understanding of things by nature, everything is caused by something else prior to it. By freedom, in the cosmological sense, on the contrary, I understand the faculty of beginning a state from itself, the causality of which does not in turn stand under another cause, determining it in time in accordance with the law of nature. So is that distinction fairly intelligible? Say we look out the window and we see someone push someone in front of a car, right? Now, there are two ways of understanding that. According to psychology, political science, sociology, all of our social sciences, that act is the result of prior acts. That the person who did the pushing has been mistreated in this way, they belong to this socio-economic status, blah, 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 blah. That led to this act. We understand that as a natural cause. Now, if you look at it in a moral sense, you would say the person could have chosen not to push the person in front of the car. That was a bad act. By using the word bad, you're implying they were free to act differently. So there were all these stimuluses to them acting in a certain way, but that person was still free to act differently. So that's a completely different way of looking at the same act. Now, Kant is saying if the person does or doesn't decide to commit that kind of act, that means that they are the beginning, they are the cause ab initio of that act. They are not determined to that act. And that if there is to be human morality and judgments of good and bad, then human beings must be able to initiate without a prior determining cause. Right, let's go on. Freedom in this signification is a pure transcendental idea. An idea means it comes from reason, not from the understanding. Okay? Which, first, contains nothing borrowed from experience. Right? He's saying that we may see acts that we think that's a noble act or a just act, or that's ignoble or unjust. But our notion of the freedom necessary for someone to do that act is not derived from any particular sense experience. It's a transcendental idea. Second, the object of which also cannot be given determinately in any experience, because it is a universal law, even of the possibility of all experience, that everything that happens must have a cause, and hence that the causality of the cause, as itself having happened or arisen, must in turn have a cause. It's almost a limerick. Okay, so freedom in this signification is a pure transcendental idea which first contains nothing borrowed from experience, and second, the object of this idea cannot be given determinately in any experience. That is the object. Okay, so noble act or ignoble act, right, cannot be given determinately in any experience. That is, it's not perceived sensibly. That is, temporally or spatially, because it is a universal law, even of the possibility of all experience, that everything that happens must have a cause. So anything that we experience is given in time and space, and that is all given in temporal order, an order that is given by the a priori form of time that is part of our thinking capability, right? Our perceiving capability. So therefore, that causation happens outside of that experience. Now, what that means, we will explore in the remaining 2 minutes. Okay. Through this law, then the entire the law that everything's necessarily determined in time and space, then the entire field of experience, however far it may reach, is transformed into the sum total of mere nature. But since in such a way no absolute totality of conditions in causal relations is forthcoming, reason creates the idea of a spontaneity which could start to act from itself without needing to be preceded by any other cause that in turn determines it to action according to the law of causal connection. Once someone acts nobly or basely, they have done something in the material world that will then cause other things to happen. But they're the originator of that. There's not a long natural sequence. Next paragraph. It is especially noteworthy that it is this transcendental idea of freedom on which the practical concept of freedom is grounded, and the former, the transcendental idea of freedom, constitutes the real moment of difficulties in the latter, which have long surrounded the question of its possibility. Okay. That's clarified that. Okay, so now he is trying to explain in this chapter how two things cohere: our spatial temporal experience of objects and the human capacity for freedom. The unending and unendable chain of cause and effect, efficient cause and efficient effect, and the capacity for human freedom. By which he means freedom to be moral or immoral, right? And I say, so we're going to get more of this next week, because in the canon of the reason in the last section, he's trying to explain how these two worlds fit together, to use a metaphor that's wildly inappropriate.
Is it sort of like saying that in the critique, to retain freedom, we have to make our actions conform to principles, sort of?
Well, because he has this, his understanding of reason is this, is something as universalizable as a mathematical theorem or as a mathematical physics natural law. Yeah. So that's when he comes to the practical works. The categorical imperative is act always such that the maximum of your action could be a universal law. The maxim, the meaning, the summary of an action could be a universal law. So therefore, he's applying the notion of reason from mathematics to human experience. But that's reason, that's not understanding. That's not perceiving a thing. But we'll get to this next week. When he discusses so if you're online, thank you for your attention, and we'll catch up next week. So it's past 2. But but if anyone had any other thoughts, or Cameron, if you had further thought, because I don't think we're being pushed out, so please feel free to, please.
Just in the passage that you just read, the spontaneity is doing a lot of the lifting of suggesting this idea of freedom that is universal. But And I can see how he's using the same word in the the schematism, our creative construction of the manifold. But he means completely different things by them, doesn't he? I mean, because the spontaneity in the manifold is not free. Like, you have to construct the manifold.
Yes, and we do so only when our sense perception has aroused the thinking apparatus. But here he is saying reason creates the idea. An idea relates to reason as concept it does to understanding. It's not related to sense perception at all.
So it's, but imagination has to come in there, does it?
No. So it's our reason creates the idea of human freedom, of this, because it must, because we have experience of morality. Right? And everything in nature is determined, so we have to create this idea of spontaneity or freedom.
Okay.
That's the way I see it. I mean, it could be different viewpoints.
There's so much to unpack there. I don't know.
Yeah.
I need a whole
Well, it is a 900-page book, so...
Can I just mention that I thought last night of a book that's been sitting on one of our shelves for a long time, Umberto Eco's Kant and the Platypus, which I don't know if any of you know that, but I think it might be worth exploring. Because Eco is pretty bright too.
Yes. Yeah, well, thank you for your attention, everyone. We'll catch up next week. Thank you.
Thanks, Martin.
And next week will be more interesting, I promise. There you go.
Made it through stages.
Yeah. We get to the world. We get to the world.